On a February morning in 1993, in the sprawling emptiness of eastern Montana, a woman vanished without a trace. Her name was Christina White Bear, a 28-year-old mother of two who lived in a modest rental house on the outskirts of Wolf Point, a town where everyone knew everyone and secrets had nowhere to hide. She was last seen by her husband on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table sorting through bills, her dark hair pulled back, her children already asleep in their beds. By Wednesday noon, when her sister arrived for their weekly coffee, the house stood silent, the door unlocked, Christina's purse on the counter, her car in the driveway. The children were at school. The coffee pot was cold, and Christina White Bear was gone. What happened in those hours between nightfall and dawn, in that ordinary house on that ordinary street, in a town where nothing ever happened? Wolf Point sits on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation in Roosevelt County, a place where the high plains stretch endlessly in all directions, where winter wind cuts through clothing like a blade, where the nearest city of any size lies more than an hour away. In 1993, the town held about 3,000 souls, a mixture of Assiniboine and Sioux tribal members and white ranching families whose ancestors had claimed the land generations before. Main Street held a grocery store, a hardware shop, 2 bars, a clinic, and the tribal administration building. People worked on the reservation in the oil fields or didn't work at all. Money was tight. Communities were close-knit. Trust was currency. Christina White Bear had grown up in Poplar, 20 miles east, the third of 5 children in a family that struggled but stayed together. She was known as a quiet girl who loved reading, who kept journals filled with poems she never showed anyone, who graduated high school despite caring for younger siblings when her mother worked double shifts at the clinic. At 20, she met Robert Greystone at a basketball game in Wolf Point. Robert was 24, a ranch hand with easy charm and a quick smile, the kind of man who could talk his way into any conversation and out of any corner. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the tribal center. Their daughter, Maya, was born the following spring. Their son, Thomas, came 2 years after that. By all outward appearances, they were building a life. Robert worked sporadically, sometimes on ranches outside town, sometimes on oil rigs near the North Dakota border, sometimes not at all. Christina cleaned houses for white families in town, worked part-time at the tribal administration office, stretched every dollar until it screamed. They rented a small 2-bedroom house on 6th Street, a structure with peeling white paint and a chain-link fence, a yard where children's toys lay scattered in the brown grass. Neighbors said they were quiet, kept to themselves mostly, though occasionally voices would rise late at night, sounds that carried through thin walls. The morning of February 9th started like any other. Christina woke at 6, made breakfast for Maya and Thomas, packed their lunches in brown paper bags. Maya was 7, serious and watchful with her mother's dark eyes. Thomas was 5, energetic and loud, always building elaborate structures with blocks or action figures. Robert had been home for 3 days, returned from a week-long job on a ranch near Circle. He slept late, as he often did. Christina walked the children to the bus stop 2 blocks away at 7:30, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands tucked into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket. Mrs. Peterson, who lived on the corner, waved from her window. Christina waved back. By 8 o'clock, Christina had returned home. Robert was awake, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, listening to the radio. She made more coffee, sat across from him, began sorting through bills that had piled up during his absence. They spoke little, according to Robert's later statements. She mentioned needing groceries. He said he might have work coming up. The morning passed quietly. At 10:30, Christina called her sister, Janet, to confirm their weekly coffee date the next day. Janet would remember later that Christina sounded tired, distracted, but not afraid, not unusual. Noon came and went. Robert said he went to the hardware store around 1 o'clock, bought supplies for a fence repair job he claimed to have lined up. The receipt would later confirm this purchase: wire, staples, work gloves. He returned home around 2:30. Christina was folding laundry in the living room. They watched television together for a while, some talk show neither of them cared about. At 3:15, Christina left to pick up the children from the bus stop. Robert stayed home. The afternoon unfolded in ordinary rhythms. Children's voices filled the house. Thomas played with trucks in his room. Maya did homework at the kitchen table. Christina made spaghetti for dinner, a meal the children ate eagerly while Robert picked at his plate. He said he wasn't hungry, that his stomach was bothering him. By 7:30, both children were bathed and in pajamas. Christina read them stories, Thomas first, then Maya. Robert watched television in the living room, volume low. By 8:30, the house had fallen quiet, both children asleep. This is where the timeline begins to blur, where certainty gives way to the fog of conflicting accounts and missing hours. Robert would later say that Christina sat at the kitchen table around 9 o'clock, sorting through bills again, making notes on a yellow legal pad. He said he went to bed around 10, tired from the day. He said Christina was still awake when he fell asleep, the light from the kitchen spilling into the hallway. He said he assumed she came to bed later, that he didn't wake when she did, that he slept heavily as he always did. But when Robert woke the next morning at 7:15, Christina was not in bed beside him. Her side was cold, undisturbed. Her slippers sat by the closet where she always kept them. The bathroom was empty. Robert checked the kitchen, the living room, the children's rooms where Maya and Thomas still slept soundly. Christina's purse remained on the counter, her wallet inside, $43 in cash still there. Her keys hung on the hook by the door. Her car sat in the driveway, frost on the windshield. Robert would later say he wasn't immediately concerned. He assumed she had gone for a walk, though she never walked in the mornings, never left before the children woke. He made coffee, got Maya and Thomas ready for school, walked them to the bus stop himself. Mrs. Peterson saw him there, noticed he seemed distracted, quieter than usual. He returned home. Christina had not returned. He waited. 9 o'clock came, 10 o'clock, 11. At 11:45, Janet arrived for their coffee date. She knocked on the front door, then let herself in when no one answered. Robert sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Christina had sat the night before. Janet asked where Christina was. Robert said he didn't know, that she had been gone when he woke up, that he had been waiting for her to come back. Janet looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and called the tribal police. Officer Thomas Redfeather arrived at 12:20. He was a veteran of the force, a man who had seen domestic situations turn dangerous, who had learned to watch for tells in people's faces and voices. He took Robert's statement carefully, writing everything in his notebook. Robert repeated his story: Christina in bed when he fell asleep, gone when he woke, no note, no explanation. Officer Redfeather asked if they had argued. Robert said no, everything was fine, normal. Redfeather asked if Christina had seemed upset or worried about anything. Robert said no, she seemed the same as always. Redfeather asked if Christina had any reason to leave, anywhere she might have gone. Robert said no, she would never leave the children, never go anywhere without telling someone. Officer Redfeather walked through the house slowly, methodically. He noted the kitchen table with papers still spread across it, the yellow legal pad with Christina's handwriting. He noted the children's rooms, neat and organized. He noted the bedroom, the bed made on one side, rumpled on the other. He noted the bathroom, toothbrushes in the holder, towels on the rack. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing seemed wrong, except that Christina White Bear was gone. By 2 o'clock, more officers had arrived. They began a systematic search of the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Christina, if anyone had heard anything unusual the night before. Most had seen nothing, heard nothing. One neighbor, Mr. Chavez, mentioned hearing a car start sometime after midnight, though he couldn't be certain of the time, couldn't say which house it came from. Mrs. Peterson said she had heard nothing at all, but then she took sleeping medication and slept with a fan running for noise. As the afternoon wore on, the search expanded. Officers walked the nearby streets, looked in abandoned buildings, checked the riverbank where teenagers sometimes gathered. Volunteers from the community joined, tribal members and ranchers alike, people who knew Christina, people who knew the family. They called her name. They looked in ditches and culverts. They found nothing. By nightfall, when Maya and Thomas returned from school, the house was filled with police officers and concerned neighbors. Janet took the children to her own home, away from the chaos, away from the questions. Robert sat on the couch, answering the same questions over and over. Yes, everything was normal. No, they hadn't fought. No, Christina wouldn't have left voluntarily. Yes, he was sure. Yes, he was certain. But those who watched him carefully, those who had seen grief and shock in all its forms, noticed something that didn't quite fit. Robert seemed calm, almost too calm. He didn't pace. He didn't cry. He didn't demand that officers do more, search harder, find his wife. He sat quietly, hands folded, waiting. Officer Redfeather noted this in his report. Husband appears unusually composed given circumstances. No visible emotional distress observed. The first night passed with no sign of Christina White Bear. The second day brought more volunteers, more searches, more questions that led nowhere. The third day, investigators began to look more carefully at the timeline Robert had provided, at the small details that didn't quite add up. Part 2. The investigation. The Roosevelt County Sheriff's Department took over the case on the fourth day, bringing resources that the tribal police simply didn't have. Detective Sarah Morrison drove up from Sydney, a woman with 15 years of experience, a reputation for thoroughness, and a particular skill at reading people. She arrived at the Wolf Point station on Saturday morning, reviewed all the reports, then asked to speak with Robert Greystone again. They met at the Tribal Administration Building in a small office with a tape recorder running. Detective Morrison went through the timeline again, asking Robert to describe every detail of Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning. Robert repeated his story. The ordinary evening, the children asleep, Christina at the kitchen table, himself going to bed, waking to find her gone. Morrison asked specific questions. What time exactly did he go to bed? Around 10, maybe 10:15. What was Christina wearing? Her regular clothes, jeans, and a sweater. What was she doing at the table, looking at bills, making lists? Did she seem worried? No more than usual. Did she say anything about leaving? No, nothing. Morrison then asked about Robert's movements on Wednesday morning. He said he woke at 7:15, checked the house, got the children ready, walked them to the bus stop, returned home, waited. Morrison asked if he had gone anywhere else. Robert hesitated, then said no, he had stayed home waiting for Christina. Morrison let the silence stretch out. Finally, Robert corrected himself. He had driven around the neighborhood for a few minutes, just looking, hopping to see her walking somewhere. Morrison asked when. Robert said around 8:30, before Janet arrived. Morrison asked which streets he had driven. Robert described a route that would have taken perhaps 10 minutes. Morrison made notes, her face neutral. She asked about the marriage. Robert said it was fine, normal, like any marriage. They had their struggles, money was always tight, but they didn't fight more than anyone else. Morrison asked if there had been any violence. Robert said no, never, absolutely not. Morrison asked if Christina had ever talked about leaving. Robert said no, she loved the children, she would never leave them. The interview lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Morrison drove to Janet's house to speak with the children. Maya sat on the couch, small and silent, while Morrison asked gentle questions. Had her parents been fighting? Maya shook her head. Had her mother seemed sad or scared? Maya said her mother had been tired. Had anything strange happened? Maya said no, everything was normal except that her father had been home more than usual lately. Morrison spoke with Thomas separately. He was less guarded, more willing to talk. He said his parents argued sometimes about money, about his father not working enough. He said his mother cried sometimes after his father left for work. He said his father got angry sometimes, threw things, but never at them, just at walls. He said the night before his mother disappeared, his parents' voices had woken him up, though he couldn't hear what they were saying. This contradicted Robert's account. Morrison noted it carefully. Over the next week, Detective Morrison and her team conducted more than 50 interviews. They spoke with everyone who knew Christina, everyone who knew Robert, everyone who might have seen or heard anything relevant. They learned that Robert had a history of unstable employment, that he sometimes disappeared for days with vague explanations about work. They learned that Christina had confided in her sister that she was worried about money, that Robert's drinking had gotten worse, that she had considered leaving but felt trapped with no money and nowhere to go. They learned that Robert had been seen at a bar in Poplar on Tuesday night, not home in bed as he had claimed, though he hadn't stayed long, perhaps an hour. They learned that Mrs. Peterson had actually heard a car around midnight, and that it had idled for several minutes before driving away. Clear's throat. The physical evidence was troubling in its absence. There were no signs of struggle in the house, no blood, no indication of violence. Christina's clothes were all accounted for, her toiletries still in the bathroom, her coat in the closet. If she had left voluntarily, she had left with only the clothes on her back, no preparations, no planning. If someone had taken her, they had done so without leaving a trace. Investigators searched Robert's car, a 1987 Ford pickup with rust on the wheel wells and a cracked windshield. They found nothing immediately suspicious, though they noted the odometer reading and began tracking his movements through gas receipts and witness statements. Robert had said he only drove to the hardware store on Tuesday and around the neighborhood on Wednesday morning. But the odometer showed he had driven nearly 60 miles more than those trips would account for. When confronted with this discrepancy, Robert said he must have forgotten other errands, maybe he drove to Poplar. He couldn't remember exactly. It was all a blur. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Robert's behavior. He seemed more concerned with protecting himself than finding his wife. He asked about his rights, whether he needed a lawyer, whether he was being accused of anything. Those who knew him said he had changed, become more withdrawn, more defensive. His mother insisted he was innocent, that he loved Christina, that he would never harm her. His friends were less certain. Some stopped coming around. The search expanded to cover hundreds of square miles of reservation land, empty prairie, abandoned homesteads, riverbanks, ravines. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Search dogs tracked scents that led nowhere. Divers checked the Missouri River and every stock pond within 20 miles. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields of dead grass. They found nothing. By the end of February, the investigation had reached a point of frustration. They had suspicions but no proof, inconsistencies but no evidence, a husband who seemed wrong somehow but nothing concrete to charge him with. Detective Morrison wrote in her report, "All indicators point to foul play. Primary person of interest remains Robert Greystone. However, without a body, without witnesses, without physical evidence, case cannot proceed to prosecution. Recommend continued investigation and surveillance." The media coverage was brief and minimal. A woman had disappeared from a reservation town. There were no dramatic press conferences, no national news attention, no rewards offered. Christina White Bear became another name in a long list of missing Indigenous women, her face on a flyer at the post office, her case filed away with hundreds of others. The volunteers stopped searching. The reporters stopped calling. Life in Wolf Point returned to its normal rhythms, except for the White Bear family, for whom nothing would ever be normal again. By April, the case had gone cold. Robert continued living in the house on 6th Street, though Maya and Thomas stayed with Janet. The community had divided into those who believed Robert was guilty and those who thought Christina had simply left. Robert himself said little, kept to himself, drank more than he should. When people saw him at the grocery store or the gas station, they looked away. The truth of what happened to Christina White Bear seemed destined to remain forever hidden, buried somewhere in the vast emptiness of eastern Montana, known only to the person who had taken her there. Part 3. The Silence. Summer came and went. The grass turned green, then brown again. Maya started 3rd grade. Thomas began kindergarten. They stayed with Janet in her small house in Poplar, 20 miles from the only home they had known, 20 miles from the father they rarely saw. Janet enrolled them in counseling, tried to maintain routines, tried to answer questions she couldn't answer. Where was their mother? When was she coming back? Would they ever see her again? Maya stopped talking about her mother around August. She had become a serious child, even more watchful than before, taking care of Thomas in ways no 8-year-old should have to. She helped make breakfast. She reminded Thomas to brush his teeth. She woke up in the middle of the night and checked to make sure he was still breathing. When her counselor asked how she was feeling, Maya said she was fine. When her counselor asked if she missed her mother, Maya nodded but said nothing more. Thomas dealt with his grief differently. He cried often, sudden storms of emotion that would pass as quickly as they came. He had nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. He drew pictures in school, always the same scene. A house, a woman with long dark hair, a man standing in the doorway. His teacher showed these drawings to Janet, who showed them to the counselor, who made careful notes but offered no easy answers. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that sick certainty in your gut that something is terribly wrong while your mind insists on giving them the benefit of doubt, imagine carrying that weight not for days or weeks but for years. Janet knew. She had always known, from the moment she walked into that house and found Robert sitting calmly at the kitchen table, that he had done something to her sister. But knowing and proving were different things. She couldn't say anything to the children. She couldn't make accusations without evidence. She could only wait and watch and keep Maya and Thomas safe. Detective Morrison checked in periodically, calling Janet every few months to see if anything had changed, if the children had said anything new, if Robert had done or said anything suspicious. Janet always asked if there had been any progress in the case. Morrison always said they were still working on it, though both women knew that without new evidence, the case would remain exactly where it was, nowhere. Robert Greystone tried to rebuild something resembling a life, though the shape of it was hollow and strange. He continued living in the house on 6th Street for 6 months, then moved to a smaller place on the edge of town, a trailer with rust stains and broken steps. He found work sporadically, a few days here and there, enough to get by. He stopped going to bars where people knew him, where whispers followed him. He drove to Sydney or Glendive when he needed supplies, places where no one knew his name or his story. His family stood by him mostly. His mother visited weekly, brought casseroles and clean laundry, refused to believe her son could have harmed anyone. His younger brother was less certain, but blood was blood, and he didn't abandon Robert even as doubts grew. Friends were scarce. The invitations stopped coming. The phone rarely rang. Robert lived in a kind of social purgatory, not quite accused, not quite free, guilty in the eyes of many but untouched by legal consequences. The children saw their father 3 times in the first year, supervised visits arranged by Janet and approved by family services. The visits were awkward, stilted conversations in which Thomas asked when his mother was coming home and Maya sat silent, her dark eyes fixed on her father's face. Robert had no answers that satisfied them. He said their mother had gone away. He said she might come back someday. He said he missed her too. Maya didn't believe him. Even at 8 years old, she could see through the performance, could recognize the careful words that said nothing true. By the second year, the visits stopped altogether. Robert said it was too hard, seeing the children's faces, answering their questions. Janet didn't fight him. She was relieved. The children settled into their new life with her, found stability in routines, began slowly to heal in ways that trauma allows. But the wound remained, festering beneath the surface, made worse by not knowing, by having no closure, no grave to visit, no final goodbye. The anniversary of Christina's disappearance came and went. Janet held a small memorial at the tribal center, invited anyone who wanted to remember Christina to share stories and prayers. 30 people came. Robert was not among them. Janet read a poem Christina had written in high school, something about rivers and returning home. Maya and Thomas stood beside her, holding hands, silent. The community grieved together, but grief without resolution feels different, incomplete, unfinished. The years accumulated in this way, one season after another, life moving forward because it has no choice even when part of you remains frozen in time. Maya turned 10, then 11, then 12. Thomas grew tall and loud, filled the house with energy and noise that covered the silence underneath. Janet aged quickly, her hair going gray, her face developing lines that hadn't been there before. She carried her sister's absence like a physical weight, always there, always pressing down. Detective Morrison retired in 1996. She handed the case file to a younger detective who reviewed it carefully, saw the same patterns and suspicions, but had no new avenues to pursue. The file went into storage, boxes stacked in a windowless room, one case among thousands. Christina White Bear became a memory, a name mentioned occasionally when someone wondered what had happened to her, a cautionary tale about the dangers women face even in their own homes. The truth seemed permanently lost, buried not just in earth but in silence and the passage of time. Robert Greystone's life continued its slow decline. He drank more. He worked less. He moved from the trailer to a room above the bar in Wolf Point, then to a friend's couch, then to a shelter in Billings for a winter, then back to the reservation. His mother died in 1998. His brother moved to Wyoming. Robert was alone, and loneliness seemed to suit him, seemed to be what he deserved. But secrets have their own weight, and that weight accumulates. For those who carry the knowledge of what they've done, who wake up every morning and face themselves in the mirror, knowing what they know, the burden grows heavier with each passing year. Robert Greystone had been living with that burden for a long time, and eventually, inevitably, something had to give. Part 4. The Revelation. In September of 2002, 9 years after Christina White Bear disappeared, Maya sat in a therapist's office in Billings. She was 16 years old, a sophomore in high school, struggling with depression and anxiety that had worsened over the previous year. The therapist, Dr. Karen Hughes, had been working with Maya for 3 months, building trust slowly, letting Maya set the pace of their conversations. On this particular afternoon, Maya sat quietly for a long time, staring at her hands. Then, without preamble, she said, "I know what happened to my mother." Dr. Hughes set down her pen carefully. She asked Maya what she meant. Maya said she had remembered something, a memory that had been buried for years, something she hadn't been able to access until recently. She described waking up on the night of February 9, 1993, hearing her parents' voices raised in argument. She described getting out of bed, walking to her bedroom door, opening it slightly to look into the hallway. She described seeing her father with his hands around her mother's throat, seeing her mother's face, seeing the look in her father's eyes. She said she had been so frightened that she closed the door immediately, climbed back into bed, pulled the covers over her head. She said she must have fallen asleep because the next thing she remembered was morning, her father waking her for school, everything seeming normal except that her mother was gone. She said she had pushed the memory away, convinced herself it had been a nightmare, that it couldn't have been real. But now, years later, she knew it was real. She remembered. Dr. Hughes followed mandatory reporting protocols. She contacted the Roosevelt County Sheriff's Department that afternoon. By evening, Detective James Walsh, who had inherited the Christina White Bear case, was on his way to Billings. By the next morning, he was sitting across from Maya, recording her statement while Dr. Hughes sat beside her for support. Maya repeated everything she had told her therapist. Detective Walsh asked careful questions, trying to establish timeline and details without leading her. Maya described the hallway, the light from the living room, what her father had been wearing, what her mother had been wearing, the sound of their voices before she saw them, the terrible silence after. Walsh asked why she hadn't said anything before. Maya said she didn't remember, that she had blocked it out, that it had seemed like a dream until recently when the memories started coming back in therapy. Walsh knew that recovered memories were controversial, that defense attorneys would tear this testimony apart, that the case remained circumstantial even with Maya's statement. But it was something, more than they had before, a thread to pull. He returned to Wolf Point and began reviewing the entire case file, looking for corroborating evidence, for anything that might support Maya's account. What he found was a case that had never been properly closed, where the primary suspect had never been cleared, where suspicion had never gone away. Walsh contacted the FBI's office in Montana, requesting assistance with what was now officially being treated as a homicide investigation. By October, 2 federal agents had joined the investigation, bringing resources and expertise that local law enforcement had lacked in 1993. They re-interviewed everyone involved in the original investigation. Janet confirmed that Maya had seemed traumatized in ways beyond just her mother's disappearance, that she had stopped talking about that night, that she had nightmares for years. Thomas, now 14, said he didn't remember much about that time, but he remembered Maya being different afterward, being scared in ways she hadn't been before. Dr. Hughes provided documentation of Maya's therapy sessions, the gradual emergence of the suppressed memory, her professional opinion that Maya was telling the truth as she understood it. Most importantly, they focused on Robert Greystone himself. He had moved back to Wolf Point 2 years earlier, living in a small apartment on the north side of town, working occasional jobs, mostly keeping to himself. Investigators placed him under surveillance, watching his movements, his patterns, his routines. They pulled phone records, financial records, employment records. They built a comprehensive timeline of his life since Christina's disappearance, looking for anything that might crack the case open. In November, they decided to confront him directly. Detective Walsh and FBI agent Michael Torres knocked on Robert's door on a gray Tuesday morning. Robert answered, unsurprised to see them, as though he had been waiting for this moment for 9 years. They asked if he would come to the station to answer some questions. Robert said yes. The interview began at 10:30 in the morning. Walsh and Torres sat across from Robert in a small room with cinder block walls and fluorescent lights. They read him his rights. Robert said he understood. They asked if he wanted a lawyer. Robert said no, not yet. He wanted to hear what they had to say first. Walsh began by reviewing the original timeline, the inconsistencies, the mileage on his truck, the witness who saw him at a bar when he said he was home. Robert listened without expression. Torres then told him about Maya's recovered memory about what she claimed to have seen that night. For the first time, something changed in Robert's face. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists on the table. He said nothing. Walsh let the silence stretch out, a technique he had learned from Detective Morrison. He and Torres sat quietly, watching Robert, waiting. Minutes passed. Robert's breathing grew heavier. His eyes filled with tears. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." What followed was a confession that took 3 hours to complete, recorded on video, witnessed by multiple officers. Robert described the argument that night, how it had started over money, over his drinking, over Christina threatening to leave and take the children. He described his anger rising out of control beyond reason. He described putting his hands on her throat, meaning only to scare her, to make her stop talking, stop threatening, stop making him feel like a failure. He described the moment he realized she had stopped breathing, the terrible understanding of what he had done. He described wrapping her body in blankets, carrying her to his truck after midnight when the neighborhood was silent. He described driving north on Highway 2, then east on back roads, deeper into the reservation, to a place he knew from childhood, a ravine 20 miles from anywhere where no one would ever think to look. He described digging in the frozen ground, the work taking hours, his hands bleeding, his back aching. He described laying Christina in the earth and covering her, stones and dirt, removing every trace of what he had done. He described returning home before dawn, cleaning the truck, burning the blankets, scrubbing the floor where her body had lain. He described waking the children for school as though nothing had happened, living the lie because he didn't know what else to do, because admitting the truth meant losing everything. He described the years of carrying that secret, the weight of it crushing him slowly, the relief of finally speaking it aloud even though he knew what it would cost. When he finished, Walsh asked him to draw a map to show them where he had buried Christina. Robert took the pen with shaking hands and sketched a rough diagram. Highway 2 to County Road 348, east 5 miles, north on a dirt track, a ravine near an old windmill. Walsh asked if he was certain. Robert said he would never forget that place, that he saw it every time he closed his eyes. The arrest was formal and quiet. Robert was charged with deliberate homicide and taken to the county jail. News spread through Wolf Point within hours, confirmation of what many had suspected for years. Some people felt vindicated. Others felt only sadness that it had taken so long, that Christina's children had lived with uncertainty for nearly a decade. The next day, Detective Walsh, Agent Torres, and a team of investigators drove to the location Robert had described. They found the ravine, the old windmill, exactly where he had said. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists. They began the careful, methodical work of excavation. On November 23, 2002, they found her. Christina White Bear, or what remained of her, buried 4 feet down in hard earth, wrapped in fragments of degraded blanket, exactly where Robert Greystone had said she would be. The relief and heartbreak were simultaneous, the terrible answer to a question that had haunted so many for so long. Janet brought Maya and Thomas to the site the next day, though they stayed back at a distance, not close enough to see but close enough to know. They stood together in the cold wind, 3 people who had lost so much, who had survived the not knowing only to face the knowing, which somehow hurt more. Janet cried. Maya stood rigid, silent. Thomas asked if they could go home now. They stayed only a few minutes, long enough to say goodbye, to close a chapter that should never have been opened. The trial took place in the summer of 2003. Robert pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide, avoiding a trial that would have forced Maya to testify, that would have dragged the family through months of additional trauma. The judge sentenced him to 60 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 30. Robert stood when the sentence was read, showing no emotion, accepting what he had known was coming. His public defender had argued for leniency, citing his confession, his cooperation, his remorse. The prosecutor had argued for the maximum, citing the premeditation, the cover-up, the years of lies. The judge sided with the prosecution. In the courtroom that day sat Janet with Maya and Thomas beside her. Behind them were Christina's friends, her cousins, her former co-workers, people who had kept her memory alive when others wanted to forget. When Robert was led away in chains, no one cheered. There was only silence, heavy and complete. Justice had been served, if such a word could be used for this, if anything about this could be called just. Closing. The case of Christina White Bear represents more than one woman's tragic end. It represents the thousands of indigenous women who go missing every year, whose cases receive minimal attention, whose families struggle alone with grief and uncertainty. Christina's children grew up without a mother because of violence that should never have occurred. Her family waited 9 years for answers that should have come much sooner. Maya and Thomas are adults now, building lives shaped by loss but not defined by it. They carry their mother's memory in ways both seen and unseen, in the strength it takes to survive, in the determination to create something better than what they were given. Christina is buried in the tribal cemetery in Poplar, her headstone simple and clean, her name finally marking a place where people can come to remember, to grieve, to say the things they never got to say. The system failed Christina White Bear as it has failed so many others, but her story, terrible as it is, serves as a reminder that truth, however delayed, however painful, matters. That every missing woman deserves to be searched for, that every victim deserves justice. That silence serves no one except those who benefit from hiding in darkness. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.